whole world was a witness to the fact that Poland, which for decades now had been a socialist, atheist state, was filled with millions of fervent believers. Karol Wojtyla was a well-rounded kid. He was an athlete, but he was also an actor. He was a playwright. He loved poetry, both to read it and to write it. And in 1946, the year after World War II ended, Karol Wojtyla became a Catholic priest. Well, fast forward 18 years, he's risen through the ranks and he becomes Archbishop of Krakow. Now, to become Archbishop of Krakow, you need the approval of the Communist Party. You need the approval, probably, of the Soviet leadership. And 7 previous candidates had been rejected by these parties, but not Karol Wojtyla. Apparently, Wojtyla was a safe choice. He was a controllable choice. As we'll see, history will demonstrate pretty clearly that this was a maybe even fatal error on their part. Well, Karol Wojtyla's rise after becoming Archbishop of Krakow was meteoric. Within 3 years, he was a cardinal. The Pope made him a cardinal. And 11 years after that, his fellow cardinals elected him to be the next Pope, Pope John Paul II. This was huge. This was momentous. A non-Italian being elected Pope, that hadn't happened for almost 500 years, 455 years, something like that. A non-Italian finally elected Pope. He was also the youngest Pope. He was 58, the youngest Pope in almost a century and a half. But he was also the first Slavic Pope. And in a Cold War context, that's hugely significant. He is the citizen, technically, of an officially atheist socialist state. So what will this mean to the ideological foundations of power in Poland and of Moscow's control of the communist bloc, such as it was in general? No one can answer these questions, but party officials in Poland, party officials in Moscow are going ballistic. How could this happen? Apparently, their intelligence services did not have tendrils that reached far enough in the Vatican. In fact, party officials in Warsaw, among themselves, officially declared the Pope as their enemy. The Pope is our enemy. That's what they said. The Pope is our enemy. He's dangerous. He's going to use the church and he's going to use the saints to defend human rights in Poland. And all of our designs to atheize the youth, these are their words, our activities designed to atheize the youth not only cannot diminish, but must intensely develop. In this respect, all means are allowed, and we cannot allow any sentiments. Even Brezhnev had advice for the Polish communist leadership, and his advice was, don't let the new Pope visit Poland. Don't receive him. Would open a Pandora's box, probably. But what could they do? Could communist officials in Poland really turn away a papal visit? That seemed more or less impossible. And John Paul II did not make things easy for them either. Immediately upon being elected Pope, John Paul II began making arrangements to visit his homeland. And before a year had passed, this is in the summer of 1979, Pope John Paul II, the Polish Pope, had arrived at the Warsaw airport. When the Pope got off the plane, he kissed the ground. This is June 2nd, 1979, and some Cold War commentators have marked this exact moment, the moment the Pope kissed the ground at the Warsaw airport, as the beginning of the end of communism in Poland and in Eastern Europe generally. He was greeted by hundreds of thousands of people in the city. The local officials, party officials were powerless to prevent this. Hundreds of thousands of Poles lined the streets chanting, "We want God, we want God." He then went to Gniezno, the old regnal capital of Poland, the first Piast kings. and hundreds of thousands greeted him there too. In Częstochowa, the crowds were even bigger. More than 1 million people greeted him there. When he made his way to Kraków, his hometown where he'd been archbishop, there were 3 million people. 3 million people out on the streets, imploring him to stay. As he left, he told them, and this would become sort of the catchphrase of his whole papacy, "Be not afraid. You must be strong, dear brothers and sisters. You must be strong with the strength of hope. You must be strong with love. When we are strong with the Spirit of God, we are also strong with faith in man. There is therefore no need to fear." Well, party officials in Poland and in Moscow were apoplectic. They didn't know what to do. The Pope's visit had blown the lid off the illusion that they were in charge. You know, an education system that had been specifically designed to turn the young people into atheists clearly hadn't worked. Millions of people came out to welcome and adore the Pope, and a huge proportion of them were youth. The ideological undergirding of the whole system seemed to be swaying and creaking and cracking, and the leadership was powerless to do anything about it. The whole world was a witness to the fact that Poland, which for decades now had been a socialist atheist state, was filled with millions of fervent believers whose ideology clashed fundamentally with that of the so-called ruling party. Well, maybe it's no coincidence that just 1 year later, 1 year after the Pope's visit, right here at the Gdańsk shipyard, at the Lenin shipyard in northern Poland on the Baltic Sea coast, could be found all of the shipyard workers on strike standing outside of the locked gate of the shipyard, organizing the first independent trade union back of the Iron Curtain. First independent workers' union since the 1940s in Eastern Europe, led by a guy named Lech Wałęsa. So Lech Wałęsa, he was a shipyard electrician, and he'd led protests before. If you go back to 1970, 10 years earlier, there'd been some food price hikes and other price hikes, other everyday items. And so protests broke out across northern Poland, but especially here at the shipyard. Back then, though, the authorities had cracked down hard. Suppression by the military and the police resulted in something like 45 deaths and 1,000 injuries. Most of those deaths, by the way, shipyard workers. So the famous shipyard killings of 1970. Well, Wałęsa he'd witnessed this. He'd been a leader of the protests. He continued to try to organize workers in the years afterwards, but he was heavily persecuted by the state, heavily surveilled, and in 1976, he was fired from his job. But then, 1979, the Pope visits, millions come out on the street, the regime is put on notice, and the next year, we've got the massive strike here at the Gdańsk shipyards again. The organization of Solidarność, or Solidarity, this trade union. August 1980, we have the shipyard workers on strike, a strike committee issuing 21 demands. And among those demands, we see things like the demand for free speech, the demand for free press, the demand for better working conditions, the demand for the right to strike. Number one of those demands was the demand to organize, the right to organize an independent workers' union. And that's what Solidarność was. In time, 10 million members were on its rolls. 10 million. So if the Pope's 1979 visit, with all those millions streaming out to greet him, hadn't put the regime on notice, the organization and quick growth of Solidarity did the trick. And as if to connect the two events, the pen that Lech Wałęsa used to sign the charter of his new organization right here at the shipyard was inscribed with a picture of John Paul II. Well, Soviet leadership in Moscow was aghast that the Polish authorities would allow such a thing. How could they not crack down? But it wasn't 1970 anymore. As I mentioned, this sort of speaks to the unraveling that the Pope's visit the year before had apparently initiated, or at least greatly helped along. Brezhnev characterized Solidarity and the formation of this independent trade union as counter-revolutionary. This was a counter-revolution that was advancing on every front. That's how he put it. It was advancing on every front, and it must be crushed. As if to prove his point, anti-Soviet protests broke out in several locations in what at the time was Western USSR, as well as in Georgia, in the Caucasus. And the Soviet Union's options were limited. I mean, what could the Soviet Union do? There was a time when the Russians would have invaded, the Soviets would have invaded. But an invasion of Poland, this really aggressive response to this, would probably invite an aggressive counter-response from the United States. A United States not led by Jimmy Carter anymore, but by Cold Warrior Ronald Reagan. Besides, should that invasion turn into a war, the Russians could not afford to open up a second war front. They were bogged down as it was in terms of blood and treasure very expensively in Afghanistan. And besides, how would it look? I mean, the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, the Soviet Union, the ideology that was sort of the foundation of its legitimacy was based on the idea that it represented the workers of the world. And how would it look if the Soviets were invading Poland, were marching against the workers of Poland? Well, by the end of 1981, the Politburo had made a momentous decision. We can look back now and say it was momentous, because at the time it was secret. But the decision was this: the Soviets were not going to send in the troops. Okay, that's huge. It's essentially a capitulation. Of course, to the wider world, that is not what they communicated. In fact, to Polish authorities, to their client state, Moscow gave the impression that they were going to invade. Well, before the year was out, December of 1981, Polish authorities, again, assuming that Soviet authorities were on the verge of ordering an invasion, declared martial law. Of course, they don't want an invasion, so they declare martial law. Okay, there's going to be a curfew. It will be enforced by tanks if necessary. Travel will be restricted. Communications will be restricted. All those nice things that go along with martial law. And Lech Wałęsa and other leaders of Solidarność are arrested. And apparently, when Lech Wałęsa was being arrested, he told his arresting officers, this is the moment of your defeat. These are the final nails in the coffin of communism. Something along those lines. In any case, Solidarity was banned by October of 1982. Now, the people of Poland did not take this martial law period lying down. It just seemed to drag on and on. There were clashes with police and the military. Scores of Poles were killed in these clashes. And then, in the summer of 1983, with martial law still going, who visits Poland again? Well, none other than Pope John Paul II. And millions of people, once again, stream into the streets to greet him. And once again, maybe we can say that it's no coincidence that within weeks of his departure, after more than a year and a half of martial law, within weeks of his departure, martial law had been lifted. Well, Lech Wałęsa was released in November of 1982. So he spent just under a year in prison. He was released the month after Solidarity had been banned. And he kept up his political activities. Of course, he's working underground. But then in 1986, Polish authorities issued an amnesty to Solidarity activists. Okay, so clear pressure here. And from this point forward, Lech Wałęsa is carrying out his political activities, overtly, out in the open, publicly. In fact, in 1988, he's right back here at the shipyard protesting and organizing workers. By the next year, 1989, Polish authorities had been convinced through negotiation with Solidarność and other opposition parties to allow semi-free elections for parliament seats. Now, Lech Wałęsa, he was, of course, suspicious. He was rightly cynical of these semi-free elections. Yeah, free elections. I'll believe it when I see it. He expected them to be rigged. But when the election results came in, virtually every free seat had been won by a Solidarność candidate. Solidarity had won in a landslide. By the end of the year, Lech Wałęsa had organized a group of non-communist parties into a non-communist coalition government. And that's huge. This is the first non-communist government in what had been the Soviet bloc. So his warning to his arresting officers back in the day about the coffin of communism, I mean, it was coming true. It had come true in Poland, and it was about to come true across that Eastern Bloc, that Soviet bloc. And the Pope continued to visit Poland. And before John Paul's tenure as Pope was up, he'd made 9 pastoral visits to Poland.